The Golden Bowl by Marjorie Cowley. Read by Brian Henderson. This video is meant for educational purposes only. All rights reserved to the author and publisher. Disclaimer. In the following chapters, you will hear about a child consuming beer. While this can be shocking to modern day readers, we need to remember that historical fiction is bound to be accurate according to what we know about the past and the time the story is set. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer was a common everyday drink drunk by men, women, and children. But there are a few things that we should know that will also help us better understand what beer was in their culture as opposed to what it is in our modern culture. First, beer in ancient Mesopotamia was often much less alcoholic than beer is today. Today, the average beer is often between 5 to 7% alcohol. In ancient Mesopotamia, the average beer was between 1 to 3% alcohol. Also, we need to remember that the ancient Mesopotamians did not have the modern medical knowledge we have that shows the effects that alcohol consumption can have on the developing brain of children and the long-term health of people. As a result, ancient Mesopotamians were unaware of the negative effects of alcohol consumption and therefore can't be held responsible, like a person nowadays can, for choosing to give alcohol to children or to drink alcohol the way that today people can be held responsible for doing that activity now. Finally, the last thing we need to also know is that the ancient Mesopotamians were also unaware of the existence of germs and bacteria. They did not know that in farming communities, the presence of so many humans and animals living together often caused water to become contaminated and unsafe to drink. The water was made safe to drink by boiling it. Since boiling water is a part of the beer making process, this, by accident, made beer often a safer drink for many people than drinking the water that flowed by their homes in the local river. Now, with this information, I hope that as we go through the following chapters, you'll be able to better understand what you will be hearing in the story and put it in its proper historical context. Chapter 7. Goddess of Beer. In the late afternoon, Jomar and the crew left the canal and walked through the camp to reach the reservoir. Zepha, stirring food in a large blackened bowl, raised her hand in greeting when she saw Jomar. "Girl, pay attention to your work," came Malik's low growl. Zepha returned to stirring the pot that rested on dull embers. When Jomar breathed in the smells of lamb and onion stew, he knew Katnu had spoken the truth. The men would be rewarded with abundant food. As the crew left the camp, Malik settled down in the shade next to another large pot. This one sat on a three-legged stand and had a ladle attached to it with braided flax. Without a word being exchanged between Malik and the slave, Katnu led Jomar and the others to a reservoir a short distance away. Once there, Katnu gave directions in a clear, calm voice as he worked alongside the men. There were fewer muttered complaints. In spite of hunger and fatigue, the men briskly cleared the reservoir of debris. They returned to camp at dusk to line up for food. Zepha and the old man scooped out the stew with chunks of freshly baked flatbread and distributed the meal to those in line. She did not look up at Jomar when he stood in front of her. It was the largest portion of food that Jomar had seen in a long time, and he crammed the delicious meal into his mouth. He could tell by the taste and light color of the bread that it had been made from wheat, not the coarse and flavorless emmer that his family had been forced to eat. Jomar sought out Katnu. "Where did this wheat come from?" "The temple granaries have great stores of food gathered from all the farmlands," Katnu answered. "Our crops have failed," Jomar's voice rose. "Our own storage bins are empty. We go hungry." Katnu hushed him with a finger to his lips. "The farmers do without so that the city of may flourish. The temple takes a portion of food and animals from the farmers to feed its officials, workers, and craftsmen," he said quietly. The farmers stopped eating when they saw Zepha and the old man struggle to move the large pot with the ladle to the center of the cooking area. Malik, on his feet and swaying, gestured for the men to come and drink. They surged around the brewpot, swilling down gulps of beer and spitting out the barley husk that floated on the surface. Although his throat was scratchy from the dust, Jomar took only one swallow. He must stay alert for whatever lay ahead. Malik pointed to Zephyr, who was finishing her meal. "Sing for us, girl!" Although his speech was slurred, his tone was one of command. With a startled look, Zephyr glanced at her brother. Jomar nodded. "Shall I sing again about the moon god Nana? Or a song to the sun god Utu?" she asked in a shaky voice. Malik snorted. "Neither. Sing to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer." Zephyr's voice shook. "I have no song to her." "Make one up," Malik ordered. Zephyr pulled out her lyre. She sat on the ground with her head down and strummed on the instrument for a long, awkward time. An angry voice rang out. "Begin!" "Play!" said another. Jomar wanted to shout at her too. Instead, he tried to imitate the calm, clear voice that Katnu had used at the reservoir. "She'll sing when she's ready." Zephyr took a deep breath and began her song hesitantly, almost in a whisper. Slowly her voice gathered force, and the song took on a lilting beat. "Hail to Ninkasi, who fills the mouth with beer, brown barley beer. Hail to Ninkasi, who taught us to make the beer, brown barley beer. Hail to Ninkasi, who knew honey frost the beer, brown barley beer. Hail to Ninkasi, who fills the mouth with beer, brown barley beer." The men listened avidly, and Jomar let out his breath with relief. Where had she learned to make up such a rollicking drinking song? The men shouted to Zephyr to sing the song again, and Jomar saw that her face was flushed with pleasure at her success. Milling around the brew pot, the men clapped their hands and joined lustily in the singing. "Again! Again!" they shouted. But when they pushed in around her, Zephyr paled and her words faltered. She held her lyre against her chest like a shield. Alarmed, Jomar looked to the slave for guidance. "A wrestling match!" Katnu shouted above the din. He looked at Jomar and pointed toward Malik, who lay sprawled in a stupor on a sheepskin robe, with his mouth open, his eyes closed. Jomar snatched up Zephyr's basket. Shoving his way through the crowd, he pulled her from the center of the group. There were angry howls of protest. Some of the men tried to stop them from leaving by grabbing at their arms, their clothes. Zephyr clutched her lyre with both hands. "Who will come forward to fight?" Katnu yelled. "The winner will take home a sack of lentils." The boisterous farmers turned their attention to the match, circling around the two men who had volunteered to wrestle. An area was cleared for the contest. Bets were placed as the name of one fighter, then the other was shouted out. Jomar tugged at Zephyr's arm, then motioned for her to follow him. Glancing back, he saw the wrestlers rubbing oil on their bodies. "Now, Zephyr, now!" Jomar said, breaking into a run. "This is our chance!" Chapter 8. The Moonlit Road. With only a slender new moon to see by, Jomar was unsure which road they were on. He ran hard, his only thought to get away from the camp. Fear made them both light-footed and fleet. Jomar heard thrashing sounds nearby. "We're after you!" came a slurred voice out of the shadows. "The slave girl will pay for this, and so will you!" It was Malik, and he was not alone. There were more confused crashing noises as the drunken men tried to hunt them down. Then a heavy thud. Malik spoke no more, but others did. "Now we'll have to lug him back to camp. It'll take the three of us to do it. We'll miss the fight." "Glad they escaped. Wish I were with them." More muffled commotion. They heard a faint dragging sound. Then silence. Jomar made out a different road ahead and took it, running until his breath gave out. Unable to stop in time, Zephyr ran into him. They hung on to each other until their heavy, painful breathing returned to an even rhythm. Jomar searched the area for the road to Ur, but paths were everywhere. He dropped to his knees, running his hands across the dirt, and to discover by touch what he could not see. Finally, Jomar stood up. "This is the road to the city. It's wide and heavily grooved by cartwheels." As they walked, they heard the faint, faraway shouts of men watching the wrestling match. Soon the night swallowed all sounds except the buzz of insects and the steady slap-slap of their sandals on the moonlit road. Jomar broke the silence. "Your lyre got us into trouble again." Zephyr stood still. "You're blaming me? You nodded when Malik ordered me to sing. Keep walking. I was frightened at what he might do if you refused, but you certainly looked happy when the men begged you to sing over and over again. What's wrong with being happy when people like my music? Zephyr said. My favorite pig was more interested in my songs than you ever were. Jomar tried to cut her off. At least we're safe and on our way to Ur. Safe? You'll be safe, but Malik, Zephyr spat out his name, has made me a slave. Worse than a slave, a runaway slave, Jomar said to himself. Ur is so big that no one will know what Malik has done. Jomar hoped this might be so, and I'll find some work for you to do. Another easy promise. Zephyr shook her head. In the city, no one will need me to care for newborn pigs or spin sheep's wool into yarn. Again, Jomar changed the subject. Your song, Zephyr. How did you come to know the rhythm of a drinking song? Last year, I heard farmers and herdsmen singing when they gathered near our house to drink beer and sleep in the fields, Zephyr said. Father went with them to the city the next morning to bring the grain and livestock that the temple demanded. Jomar kicked a few stray dirt clods. Our barley could have made the very beer that Malik was guzzling. It doesn't matter where the barley came from, Zephyr said. We couldn't have escaped if he hadn't gotten drunk. Jomar sighed. But it was the slave who thought of the wrestling match so we could get away. Zephyr's voice grew soft. I hope someday the gods will reward him for his kindness to us. Jomar thought about the fresh wounds that would appear on the slave's back if Malik suspected he had helped them escape. Yes, Katnu was kind and brave. The cool of the night helped them walk at a fast pace. They shared Zephyr's almonds and raisins between them, eating slowly to make them last longer. Zephyr stopped again and shivered. Everything looked so strange, scary. Jomar gazed around him. The land, white with evaporated salt caused by the drought, was bathed by eerie moonlight that made it look even whiter. It does look strange, but we have to keep walking. They trudged on until Zephyr held up her hand. Listen, a baby's crying. Around a bend, 3 men and 2 women sat huddled for warmth around a small fire by the side of the road. One woman held a wriggling, wailing baby in her arms. They can't quiet that baby, Jomar whispered. Don't stop. Zephyr ignored him and walked toward the people crouched around the low flames. Jomar caught up with her and pulled at her sleeve. We've had enough trouble for one day. I don't want to spend much time here. Straining to be heard over the baby's cries, Jomar spoke to the oldest man. My sister and I need food to complete our journey to the city. Do you have some you can spare? We returned back at the gate, so we must save what's left of our food for the journey home, the man answered. Be warned, unless you can show that you have business or employment in Ur, you'll be denied entrance. Jomar glanced nervously at Zephyr. How would he get her into the city? He pointed behind him. We've just escaped from a work crew. You must stay away from a temple official called Malik, who will force you to help clear the waterways. The man nodded his thanks. The woman stood, holding her baby over her shoulder. She paced in a wide circle around the fire, yet still the baby wailed. My boy cries for milk, but his mother has little to give him, the man said. We have only 1 she-goat left on our farm. When we get home, I hope her milk can nourish my son. Zephyr took out her lyre and began strumming a shower of notes, then leaned close to the baby. Don't weep, black-eyed baby boy. Don't weep. Sleep soft, black-eyed baby boy. Sleep deep. She sang the lullaby first in a strong voice, then softly, and finally the words disappeared into a soothing hum. The baby's wails were now interspersed by silence, as if he listened between sobs. Suddenly, he stopped crying, put his head in the crook of his mother's neck, and fell asleep. But Zephyr's rhythmic strumming continued for a few more moments. Then her hands were still. Thank the gods he's sleeping, the mother whispered. The baby's father looked at Zephyr. It's you we thank, girl. He spread a small square of cloth on the ground. Quickly and quietly, each person brought out a small amount of food and placed it on the cloth. The father tied the corners together and thrust it into Jomar's hand. This exchange was fair and good, he said. You will see the gates of the city before noon tomorrow. May you find what you seek in Ur. Chapter 9. Great Gate of Ur. Jomar took the food and bowed his head in gratitude. Then he and Zepha left the group. When they turned to wave farewell, they saw sheepskins already unrolled and laid out on the ground in preparation for their long-delayed rest. Jomar patted Zepha on the back. Singing to that baby was a good way to get food. That isn't why I did it, Zepha said. But I noticed they gave the food to you, not me. It's because I'm the oldest, Jomar said. Zepha shook her head. Unfair. She slipped the reed basket off her back. They're sleeping. What about us? Mother thought we'd be in Ur by nightfall, so we have no blankets, Jomar said. I'm too tired to need bedding. Without another word, Zepha shook out her loose braids, then stretched out on the ground by the side of the road. Jomar lay down beside her, cradling his head in his arms. He hummed Zepha's lullaby and sank into an exhausted sleep like the baby on his mother's shoulder. When he awoke, the warmth of the new day covered him like a thin cotton blanket. He looked at Zepha, still sleeping. The strain on her face had been smoothed away by rest. Wake up, Zepha. The sun god begins his ride across the sky. Zepha gave a small moan and sat up. She ran her hands through her hair and began braiding it. Father was right. Her long black hair no longer shone. He touched her shoulder gently. Your song helped me get to sleep. Zepha smiled. It was almost the same lullaby I sang to my favorite pig after it was born. Instead of black-eyed baby boy, I used to sing pink-eyed pretty pig. He smiled back at her, then realized this was the first time in their journey that he had done so. They started out again, but now they were not alone on the rutted road. Where had these people been last night? Had they too slept by the side of the road or bedded down in empty fields? Most of the travelers going toward the city were raw-boned, single men carrying heavy burdens on their shoulders. Looking slightly more prosperous, a few men walked beside loaded wooden carts pulled by small, straining donkeys. The families with dawdling young children traveled slowly. The people moving in the opposite direction looked defeated, their shoulders hunched, and their eyes upon the road. Seeing the children reminded Jomar of his first trip to Ur. When he was a little boy, his father had taken him to the great temple to watch the ceremonies that greeted the new year. He remembered his father's comforting hand on his shoulder as they walked toward the city. Like the fragment of a long-ago dream, he recalled the splendor of the celebration, the sacrifice of a great bull with gold-tipped horns, and the throngs of joyous people. He looked around him. Now weary travelers on the road were seeking relief from their failing farms. Zepha brought Jomar out of his reverie. What food did they give us last night? Jomar untied the food pouch, and they greedily ate the small goat cheese, briny olives, and 2 wrinkled plums. They cracked open the husk of pistachio nuts with their teeth and spit out the empty shells as they walked. The meal was meager. To distract himself from his persistent hunger, Jomar searched the land stretching far ahead. Zepha, look, he said, coming to a halt. In the heat-hazed distance, the tan-colored earth rose up from the flat plain and took the shape of a mud brick wall that wrapped itself around the city. This is the wall that guards the temple of the moon god and all the wealth of Ur. They started walking again, but the strained expression on Zepha's thin face returned, and her feet dragged. Others on the dusty road began to pass them. Walk faster, Jomar told her impatiently. Everyone must speak to the gatekeeper to see if they can enter the city. We don't want to lose our place. As they neared the wall, Zepha pointed to a group of tattered men, women, and children, clustered close to it. They're not waiting in line. What are they doing there? Wait, I'll find out, Jomar said. Coming closer, he found crude shelters huddled against the wall that offered some protection from the blistering sun, but no privacy. Jomar spoke with a gaunt man with sad eyes who told him they were offering themselves as slaves in return for food and a place to sleep. Jomar returned to Zepha. They're hoping to be hired by those who live inside the city, he told her. Zepha clutched his arm. Promise me you'll stay with me no matter what happens? Jomar peered at his sister's frightened face. I promise. Aware of other travelers trying to pass them, Jomar steered Zepha toward the small kiosk that bulged out from the wall. Inside was the man who determined the fate of all who would enter the city. The sun bore down as they stood in the long, snaking line of people. Children grew quarrelsome with waiting. The odor of anxious, exhausted travelers merged with the sweat of burdened donkeys. From the front of the slowly moving line, angry or pleading voices could be heard, but not the words of the gatekeeper. "Let me in! My whole family starves in the countryside. I'm a skilled carpenter, and my wife's an excellent cook. Unfair! The city depends on us for food, but abandons us when times are bad." Jomar and Zephyr were almost at the gatehouse. How many people were getting in? From the steady stream of dazed and stony faces being turned away, not many. "Who are you, and what is your business in Ur?" the gatekeeper asked in a droning voice as they finally stood before him. Jomar straightened his shoulders. "I'm Jomar, son of Durabi. My father made an arrangement with a goldsmith who works for the temple. I'm to be his new apprentice." The man gestured toward the gate. "Then enter." He looked at Zephyr. "And this young girl?" Zephyr's strong fingers gripped Jomar's arm. "She's my sister," Jomar said in a voice that seemed too loud. The gatekeeper looked at Jomar, narrowed his lips, and waited for him to continue. "And," he snapped, "where will she live? What will she do?" Jomar's tongue seemed stuck to the roof of his parched mouth. The people behind them grumbled impatiently. "We're waiting! Hurry up!" someone called out. "Speak!" the gatekeeper said. My sister's a musician," Jomar stammered. "We have temple musicians," the man said irritably, "and we don't need any more hungry young players roaming the streets." Jomar snatched Zephyr's lyre from her basket and held it up. "A toy," the gatekeeper snorted. "No, not a toy," Zephyr said firmly, and took the lyre from Jomar's hand and held it in position. "This is no place for a concert," a young man behind them said angrily. But Zephyr moved her fingers over the lyre's strings and began a hymn to the sun god in a breathy, nervous tone. "Moon god Nana, your son we glorify. Each dawn you send us Utu in his chariot, golden bright, pulled by four prancing steeds that surge across the sky. Utu battles darkness to defeat the night. Bold Utu battles darkness to give us morning light." Jomar watched the gatekeeper's scowl of contempt disappear as Zephyr's voice steadied and soared as she sang. He heard people murmuring behind them. "Her music honors Utu," a strong voice rang out. "Let her in!" The gatekeeper leaned toward Jomar and spoke in a troubled whisper. "I could lose my position if the temple officials find out what I've done, but I'll allow your sister to enter the city. You must not speak of her skills to anyone, lest she be pressed to join one of the bands of music-making beggars." He gestured with his thumb towards the open gates. "Go, but keep her safe off the streets."